that is Amy Klin. Amy Klin is an eminent teacher of psychology from Yale University and is a well-known researcher in this field. He has a lot of manuscripts that everyone in this room knows. And now we are going to give the word to Amy Klin.
Buenos días. Es un placer muy grande estar aquí en España, estar aquí en la ciudad y en Sevilla. Y me gustaría muchísimo agradecer a todos que me invitaran a la asociación y muchos amigos que están aquí. Es un placer muy grande. Le voy a decir que fue un esfuerzo llegar aquí. Salí yo de Estados Unidos el miércoles y aquí estoy viernes. Podría estar yo en China, pero mejor estar en Sevilla. Así que es un placer muy grande. Y ahora pasa al inglés. It's a real pleasure for me. Initially, I was asked to talk about, thank you, about neuroimaging studies. But I've been hearing all morning about all sorts of things. I just heard from the Secretary and from others about the importance of early identification of children with autism and children with Asperger syndrome. And we all heard a wonderful presentation that Rita Jordan provided before. And she mentioned many things that I would like to, if at all possible, to emphasize the importance. She gave some examples, and she talked about the fact that it's often the case that, certainly for Temple Grandin, but certainly for others, that people experience the world as if it was a video, without necessarily being engaged in it, without necessarily feeling that the kind of immediate sense of being part of that world. And we need to understand that well, because many of the folks that we work with have that sense of explicit knowledge about the world without necessarily feeling that they are living in that world. And therefore, yes, they don't feel that there is much point in interacting with others. So that was one thing that I thought it was very important. And second is that sometimes we teach individuals with Asperger syndrome and we feel that we have done our job. They know the rules. They are often explicit rules. And there is the sense that they are competent, that they can meet the demands of everyday life. When in fact it's not so. And in fact, we know that there is a tremendous discrepancy between their intellectual skills and their ability to navigate the demands of everyday life. And we ask ourselves, why so? If it just takes a rule to be learned, and once they learn the rule, how come they still have difficulty? And in fact, people tend to look at those individuals and feel, my goodness, they are so bright, and they can certainly understand the rules, and yet they transgress those rules all the time. Because many of us don't understand why, we tend to blame them. We tend basically to blame them for their disability. And when they get themselves in trouble, we call them bad kids, when in fact they are not doing that because they are bad, because they are willfully doing so, but that's because they don't necessarily have an intuitive sense of what is going on around them. So given those various different factors, I thought that it might be a little bit more helpful for me to come here and talk a little bit about where it all begins. And it begins really in infancy. And that's why I'm going to focus this presentation on infancy. So my name is Amy Klin. I direct the autism program at the Yale Child Study Center at Yale University. And we are a group of scholars there from multiple different disciplines, from the clinical sciences into the basic sciences, all of us interested in addressing the causes of autism and related conditions, trying to understand how to improve treatments that are empirically based something that is going to help those individuals and their families. We are a clinical program, so we see individuals there for clinical assessments from babyhood through their lives. I, in fact, see on a weekly basis one individual who is 48 years old, who was first seen at the Child Study Center at the age of 20 months. Not by me, by my predecessors, but I inherited his care about 15 years ago, and here's a gentleman and his family really taught us a great deal about what is it like to go through the different life transitions. We are a research program. We are interested in issues related to nosology and classification, style of learning, the social mind, social brain, in genetics, in neurobiology, in neurochemistry. We like to believe that we go from genes to access to services. But the idea is to contribute to the field. We're a training program. We train individuals from different disciplines, physicians, psychiatrists, child psychiatrists, psychologists, speech-language pathologists, clinical social workers, and really anybody who wants to serve this community. And we're also an advocacy program. We work very, very closely with parent support organizations locally, where I am from. By the way, I come from the United States, from the state of Connecticut, New Haven. And we work with the parent support organizations in our town, in our state, in the country, and of course, our very, 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 very good friends from Portugal and Spain, as well as Autism Europe. And that's why I'm here. Now, even though we are engaged in those different activities, the autism program at the Child Study Center has always been and always will be, first and foremost, a clinical services program. And in many different ways, we feel that our very best research hypotheses come from our playrooms. It comes from our interview rooms. And the reason for that is because we would like for our research to be relevant. And by keeping our minds straight into what are the issues to our patients coming through, it makes it possible for us, I hope, that our research is going to have more immediate implications for not only what happens in our clinics, but what happens in the classrooms, what happens in the community at large. Now, the term Asperger syndrome, of course, has different connotations to different people in different parts of this world. I'm going to simplify things. Thankfully, I was asked to give a talk tomorrow about future research in this area. So in order for me to give that talk, I have to start with young children. But let's just recap a little bit. This gentleman, Leo Kenner, described 11 children who, in his mind, had been born with an inability to relate with others. This was back in 1943 at Johns Hopkins in the United States. And most of the children that he saw at that time were young children, and many of them also had a degree of intellectual disabilities. About a year later, this gentleman, who was a pediatrician interested in special education, intellectual disabilities, Hans Asperger, described 4 individuals who, in his mind, also had a profound social disability. But I guess happenstance, he saw slightly older individuals and individuals who were intellectually more able. And so he described the issues that they faced in their everyday life. And interesting enough, one of the things that really caught his mind was the fact that those children tended to get themselves in trouble all the time. And they tended to get themselves in trouble not because they were bad children, but because they didn't seem to have an intuitive sense of the rules and regulations of being in the community, of being in a school. They seemed to be kind of blind to nonverbal forms of communication, to things that we all take for granted, like what happens in our face, what happens in our body, what happens in our voice. And they're very explicit in the way that they learn about the world. In fact, they're very verbal about the way that they learn about the world. But unfortunately, in this world, and you included, you tend to say things that you don't mean, and you mean things that you don't say. And if you do so, you are very difficult to understand if you don't have an intuitive sense of the other. And those children tend to lack that. And so he focused on that. He also focused on the fact that they tended to use their strengths, which were primarily verbal learning and explicit learning. And so they had to, as it were, intellectualize what for other people comes as second nature, which has to do with people's emotions and people's intentions and so forth. Now, those 2 individuals were very, very, very influential clinicians. And their writings became what we have these days. Now, there has been 66, 65 years since then. And interesting enough, their descriptions are still what we know clinically about individuals with a social disability of early onset. Now, a lot has been made, and people have written a great deal, and I wouldn't even sort of exclude the Child Study Center on that one, about is this the same or is it different if we use this kind of definition or that kind of definition. The bottom line, and that's what I'm going to focus on here today, is that when it is called autism or what is called Asperger syndrome, we are talking about a very heterogeneous group of conditions that emerge very early on in life and which impacts on a person's ability to develop relationships with others. And I want to focus on that so that I'll leave it all to tomorrow for us to talk about the niceties of this or that definition. What we've learned since, of course, and believe me, we've all been fallen victim to that. I remember in the 80s and 90s, because people knew in the United States that we are very interested in higher functioning individuals who are intellectually talented, that have their IQs within normative range, we would receive those referrals from everywhere. And the feeling was that we probably saw every single prototypical person with Asperger syndrome there. And then we start seeing many individuals who are not prototypical at all. And they had very complex conditions, except that at the center of it was a social disability of early onset. And so we know that there is a tremendously varied expression to this syndrome, or to this family of syndromes. And nowadays we use the term spectrum to capture that. And this spectrum is vast indeed. If you put everything in, you have individuals who range from having profound intellectual disabilities to individuals who are more intelligent than you or I. Individuals who don't talk at all to individuals who talk too much. Individuals who are so socially isolated that if you observe them in their schools, you see them running the periphery fence of the school day if you let them. To individuals who cannot stop coming to you and asking you questions and engaging you, even though maybe in an awkward fashion, and that's what gets them in trouble. So the variability is huge. And those are the kinds of things that bother researchers. Because researchers like for life to be simple, they like for individual groups to be very homogeneous, so that if they research something and they find something, they say, well, it applies to this group. But we have to embrace this complexity. Individuals with autism and related conditions, including Asperger syndrome, are individuals who really can range the whole gamut of intellectual abilities and language abilities, and in fact, social abilities and disabilities. But this is the model. The model that I propose to you is that in autism, there is a reason why we come into this world and we have to orient to people. Infants are born so fragile. Can you imagine if you left a baby sort of in a room by himself or herself, what would happen to that baby? Well, that baby would not survive. Human infants, more than even in other species, are extraordinarily dependent of their caregivers. This is something that we need to take it very seriously, because it makes great sense from an evolutionary standpoint that we are born with mechanisms of socialization, things that push us towards others. We need to be pushed towards our caregivers, and our caregivers find us very, very interesting as well. And it's out of this mutually reinforcing choreography that a lot that is important in development seems to emerge. Things that have to do with the emergence of mind, seems to have to do with the emergence of the social brain. And for some reason, individuals with autism come into this world with attenuated mechanisms of socialization. Things that appeal to other babies don't seem to appear to them very clearly. Now, what I was telling you, the usual diagnosis or the name that is given to is autism. Now, what do we know about the early childhood, the infancy of individuals with Asperger syndrome? Nothing. We don't, because that label tends to be something that is applied to individuals who are older. And so it's only now that we are beginning to think that, my goodness, I'm sure that those individuals also had infancy. They were born, they were little children, and they behave in such way that we are beginning to think that in order for us to understand what happens to them later, we need to understand where it all begins. And it begins in infancy. And by the way, I'm not espousing here a psychoanalytic view. I'm espousing here a developmental neuroscience view, which is the notion that a lot of what happens in our mind and in our brain develops rapidly in the first 2 years of life. And even though I heard today that individuals with Asperger syndrome might be diagnosed only later in childhood, maybe in school age, the fact is that this condition, as all of the autism spectrum disorders, should be diagnosed in the first 2 years of life. If you walk into a daycare for typically developing children, you're soon going to find out that by the time that babies and toddlers become 2 years of age, they are accomplished social interactionists. They understand others, they react to others. And it's fascinating to us that many of our students at a much later stage in their lives, even though they can accomplish great things in some areas, they fail to show the same form of intuitive attunement to the world, the same kind of skills that we see in typically developing 2-year-olds. Now, it's not that our students with Asperger syndrome are like babies. They are certainly not. It's that they've been learning about the world differently. And so when somebody comes to us and say, gosh, I spent all day pretending to be normal, or that I watch the social world as if it was a videotape, it's critical for us to understand that those are individuals who are trying to be part of that world, but they have built their conception of that world rather differently. And if you want to be an effective clinician, the best thing you can do is to leave your own preconceptions about that social world at home. And you need to step into their shoes and take, in a way, the perspective of their eyes and step into their hearts and really understand how is that they see it. Because a lot of the things that are second nature to you are often inaccessible to them. And there are many things that you find so difficult, they can do very well. So we as a field often spend a great deal of time talking about the disabilities of autism or Asperger syndrome. But Frankie's here, I'm sure she's going to talk about that too, Frankie Happe, that we don't spend enough time thinking about how they build the world. Okay? Now, about social development. From the first days of life, babies prefer to listen to human sounds rather than sounds in the environment. They prefer to listen to speech sounds. From the first days of life, they prefer to look at people than at things, and not only anything in the person, but particularly the person's eyes. You know, if there is something that is an intersection between neuroscience and poetry, is the eyes. There's something very special about it. A lot that goes inside our minds, our intentions, and our hearts, our feelings, are conveyed through the eyes. And that's not just a sort of a beautiful description of what a part of the body is. It's something that it's been with us, meaning all of us, all primates, for a long, long time. Because baby primates also look at their mother's eyes, and vice versa. It's basically a way of stepping outside of oneself and into the other. It's a way of connecting. And this is something that has been demonstrated in newborns. Okay? So keep in mind that. Now, there are many other social abilities that by the time that we are 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 months, we are demonstrating without any problem. So just keep that in mind for the moment. The reason why I put this picture in here is because this is truly the greatest challenge to individuals with Asperger syndrome and autism. It's when you take all of the structures, it's when there are no explicit rules, it's when they are walking into their school cafeteria, and they need to make sense of what's going on there. At that time, it's very hard. Because, yes, we can teach rules and regulations to our folks, and they can do better in life, but the fact is that, first of all, they need to find out what is relevant out there so that they can make a problem to solve. And if there is one thing that is difficult for them, it's that. And say, for example, that there was a riot going on in that particular school cafeteria, many of our children would either walk right through that riot without noticing, or they might be scared because there was a noise or something. But they wouldn't be able to know what's going on there so that they can defend themselves. Now, this picture is also there because it is at the basis of our lab, of our laboratory and our research studies. Scientists like to simplify the world. They like to present stimuli to their research subjects that are very simple. Why? Because if they do so, they have a sense of scientific rigor. Now, we know that in autism, this is the most challenging situation. So one of the things, one of the decisions that we made very early on was to embrace that complexity, meaning that all of our research involves really naturalistic stimuli. We have a feeling that when people walk in the world, they don't see static faces. They don't recognize emotions in static faces. They see people moving around. They see people approaching them. They see and hear them at the same time. And if we want to get a sense of what are the difficulties that they have in the real world, we better bring this back into the lab, and we better, no, I don't need that. We better bring that into the lab and try to develop our measures so that we can capture and quantify those difficulties. Now, we've been hearing a great deal about early identification. So I just thought that it might be a good idea for me to bring in here a little baby. She's only 15 months of age, and I'm trying to interact with her. And I would like you to tell me what's so special about her as I am trying, not so because when you enter somebody's space, whether it is a 2-year-old or the 3-year-old, you enter that playroom, the world changes for both of you. There are many things that we do in the privacy of our home, right, that you prefer not to share with others. But the moment that we are in the public eye, our behavior is entirely different. And somehow, for that little girl, my presence is not making much of a difference. Now, I'm still trying to engage her. And see what happens here. Yeah. Well, what happened is this, is that I wasn't able to really engage her, even though I was 2 inches away from her nose, but she was able to find a little piece of candy, an M&M, about 4 or 5 feet away from me. So I thought, well, apart from feeling bad, right, that an M&M attracts her more than me, I was trying to understand about how does she see this world. I bet that most of you have not counted the number of light fixtures in this room. Have you? Or the number of panels in those walls. You haven't, because that's not necessarily too relevant to what's going on. But most of you have seen Rita Jordan and seen me, right? Because it is relevant, we're giving the lectures. So in a way, the first thing that we would like to capture is what is this kind of landscape of visual salience that goes on for this little girl? What are things that are important and what things that are not? And in order to sort of really concretize this to you, I would like to show you now a little video of a 3-month-old typically developing baby, okay? Sometimes neuroscientists like to say that social behavior is something so complex that in order for us to study something of brain meaning, we have to go much, much, much more basic than that. So let's just see a 3-month-old little girl. I wish I had sound. I'll try once more. You have to believe me. But this is a 3-month-old little baby, and this is her mother. And if you could hear what you say, is that every single reaction of that little 3-month-old baby is contingent to what the mother is saying. Does she understand what the mother is saying? No, she does not. But from that early age, they are entirely attuned. And what you see is that they are taking turns over and over again. They are having a conversation. They're having a prosodic conversation. But that's a conversation. That's exactly where the words are going to fit. And as you probably know, many individuals with Asperger syndrome are really capable of talking very well. Many of them are more articulate than you or I. But all of them will have issues with their voice, in the sense that it's more difficult for them to both perceive the intentionality in voice patterns as it is for them to express. And yet, that aspect of communication is one of the most basic things ever. By the way, that's the way that monkeys communicate too. They communicate via cries. And those cries have very important expression of emotion or expression of survival instincts. And that's something that is not quite there. But this is just to concretize to you that we're talking about something that is quite basic. Okay? So, this is the model. The model is that we come into this world predisposed to orient and engage with others. And if you start in that way, you're going to follow a developmental trajectory. And you may start here, but you may end up here, become an expert about the social world. You develop relationships, you have a sense of what goes on in other people's minds, you have a way of developing those relationships. Now, if you start over here, maybe you have a divergence process. Because if you are learning more about something other than the social world, and you are learning, and it's often the case that I'm learning about things that I can't understand, I may become an expert on this world. It's a physical world, and they are learning ever more complex things, but things nevertheless. Okay? And of course, that what we would like to see is somehow to alter this trajectory, so that we can, maybe early on, maybe capitalizing on neuroplasticity, to bring those children to become more engaged, more interested in the social world. Well, what's the end point of that particular divergence there? Well, this is the work of a 16-year-old young man with Asperger syndrome that I'll talk more about him tomorrow. We've known him for many years. But at the age of 16, he came and I was interviewing him, and he told me that if he ever found out that he will never have a girlfriend, he would kill himself. He was very depressed. And as a clinician, of course, I was worried about that, but I was even more worried about something else, because I was going to ask him, how in the world was he going to find out that he will never have a girlfriend? And he was a man who had tremendous difficulty in understanding other people's emotions. He was perplexed about others. But he was very good at solving problems using algebraic equations. And so one thing that he used to do is to assign a letter to people's emotions, to create an equation, and to solve them with the hope that in this way he would gain more insight into others. And my real worry was that in many different ways, one day he would go QED. He solved his equation. He will never have a girlfriend, and then he'll be in danger. Now, how can somebody be so intuitively, removed from an intuitive sense of relevance, from an intuitive sense of oneself? Rita was talking this morning about the fact that self-awareness is not one of the big strengths of our folks. Of course not. You learn about yourself by learning about others. And because they are so confused and perplexed about others, they are equally confused and perplexed about themselves. And those things end up replacing an intuitive sense of self, and then they can be in trouble. But when we see those things at the age of 16 and 17 and so forth, we are ourselves very confused. And that's one of the reasons why I want to go back. I want to go back and really try to see the world of those infants and toddlers with autism spectrum disorders, but through their eyes. Okay? And the way we do those things is that we use eye tracking technology, which is something very, very non-invasive, that we can collect data about what children are looking at without their even noticing that something is going on. It's done remotely. It's not something that they need to be aware. Why we're doing this? Why we're doing this? Because, again, as a clinician, I feel that I am a walking laboratory of social engagement. I know a little bit about the babies and infants. I've seen them a lot. But one thing that has been very frustrating is that we all have a nuanced view of what is it like to socially engage with another person. But the kinds of techniques that we use to quantify that are pretty dreadful. In many different ways, they're very one, explicit, and social engagement is anything but explicit, and they don't seem to capture and quantify that intuitive sense of engaging another person. So those are the reasons why we've been developing those techniques. Now, you remember that little girl, right? That little 15-month-old toddler. I'll call her Helen. Well, here is Helen looking at a video of a caregiver approaching her, okay? So the caregiver is trying to talk to her. You're not going to hear the sound because my computer is not working, or the system is not working, but believe me, what that caregiver is saying is, hi, baby, how are you, that kind of a thing, okay? And this crosshair here, if you can see, tells you exactly where that little girl is looking at. Can you see what she's looking at? She's spending a lot of time looking at this woman's mouth, and then she alternates with the object here and back and forth. Now, remember, something that I mentioned to you before, the eyes are the window to the soul. Believe me, that most of this woman's emotional approach, the social approach, takes place over here, not so much over here. So we try to imagine, what is the experience that this little girl is having by approaching the person who is approaching her in that way? Well, we did that as a case study. That little girl taught us quite a bit. You're going to see her more later on. But then, of course, we had to run a study. And in this study, we compared 3 different groups of 2-year-olds. So these are toddlers, okay, 2-year-olds. A group of toddlers with autism, and then we compared them with typically developing 2-year-olds, and then we compared them with a group of cognitively and language-delayed toddlers, 2-year-olds, who did not have autism. This is always important for us to do, because otherwise we don't know if a finding that we may have is due to cognitive delays or to autism, okay? And so we use those 3 groups. And when they watch a lot of videos of these women approaching them, this is not static pictures, these are videos, okay? And this is what happened. We found out that the toddlers with autism spend much less time looking at the caregiver's eyes than the 2 other groups. And they spend much more time looking at the mouth than the 2 other groups. I'll focus on that only. Now, the one thing that was interesting to us is that those 2 groups here, these are typically developing toddlers and non-autistic but cognitive delayed children. You see there are 2 lines here. The results for the delayed children but non-autistic were absolutely identical to what we got for the typically developing children, which made us feel like, gee, we are really talking about a skill that is so fundamental, it's so basic, it emerges so early, that even those 2-year-olds who had cognitive delays, they acted exactly like their typical peers, okay? So this is how fundamental that engagement with the eye of the other seems to be. Now, this addresses a little bit what we're trying to do. Of course, clinicians have to have the final word, but in science, we need to quantify them. We need to objectify them. And what this slide is showing is basically that among the children with autism, the less they look at people's eyes, the more disabled they were, using a standardized instrument to measure social disability. And so it made us feel good, because here was a skill measured in the lab in about 5 minutes, that was actually predicting what happens to those children in real life. Okay? And that made us feel good. Now, let's go back to that little girl. Remember that I wasn't engaging her very well. She didn't seem to be engaged with the eyes of others. What I wanted to know is what was going on in her mind. If she's not looking at people, can she think about people? There is something about looking and thinking, right? Do you have a sense that I am thinking about you? Yeah? Do you feel that I'm thinking about you? ¿Crees que estoy pensando en usted? Sí, ¿y por qué? Porque te miro. Funciona siempre. A ver, mi colega aquí, Carlos, ¿estoy pensando en usted? Sin duda, okay. There is something very special about the fact that looking at means also thinking about. That's the reason why you go into the hotel and you are in the elevator, you look up, you look to the side, you look down, but you don't look at the other person, right? And how come you don't do that? Because there is a clear sense that if you're looking at someone, you are thinking about that person, okay? Monkeys do the same, but they do that much more quickly. And looking at another monkey really means that you're threatening them. And so it has tremendous survival value, okay? So, let's go back here. She's not looking at people. Is she thinking about them? How can I go about asking her, excuse me, Helen, you're 15 months of age. I would like to know if you can think about me. Well, that's not the way, is it? She ain't going to answer that question. And so we used a sort of a well-known experimental paradigm. We basically transform people into point-like displays. And so here is how we created those stimuli, okay? You know what? You're going to have to take a lot, my word, today, because a lot that I was going to show you has audio. Okay? So I'm sorry. But take my word for it. So here is the young man, and he is approaching a baby, okay? And he's going, hey, how are you, and so forth. We transform that man into point-like displays, and then you can see what's going to happen. Patty cake, baker. You know that one? It's a very famous one in England. Okay. So the moment that those lights begin to move, people just forget that those are lights, and they know what's happening. Now tell me, even though you can't hear anything here, what's going on there? Fight. There is a fight. They're fighting. Okay? So you need very little information. Now, I'm sorry to say, even for those of you who helped me here, that you are able to do something that newborns do very competently. In fact, newborns, when they see those point lights, we call them biological motion. They are capable of not only distinguishing that, but they orient to that. In fact, it's not only newborns, human newborns, you see that in other animals. In fact, you see that in newly hatched chicks. Chicks means chickens, okay? And this is something that is part of the imprinting mechanism. It's something very basic indeed. So what is biological motion? Biological motion is something, movements that we all make that connote biology, that connote basically people, okay? And it's not only seen in those point lights, but the movements of our eyes, the movements of our face and our gestures. All of those things are exemplars of biological motion. We just know that this is people. And primates know that this is primates. And dolphins know that these are dolphins. It's a highly conserved, evolutionarily based skill. Okay? And this is something that we are very interested in. Because immediately, the moment that you see that, it doesn't take that much effort for you to see this as people. It's impossible almost not to see them as people. Another interesting thing, even though I'm not talking about the brain today, but we know very much what are the neural bases of the ability to perceive biological motion. My colleague at Yale, Kevin Pelfrey, has sort of done many studies, and what he found out is that there is a very important node in the social brain, in the superior temporal sulcus, that seems to be key node for processing biological motion. Now, what is interesting to us is that many other things that we do in our social engagement with others, like, for example, processing gaze direction, where somebody is looking at, or understanding that somebody is smiling or somebody is mad, facial expressions, those skills are also subserved by brain circuitry very close by, as it were. Those things are very closely tied together. Interesting enough, this is something that doesn't happen only in humans, it happens in animals as well. The notion here is this. When I was slightly shorter than I am now and hairier, and I jumped from branch to branch to branch, I was a monkey. But don't worry, this is just a theory, okay? So when I was a monkey and I was jumping from branch to branch, if I encounter another monkey, I better pay attention. Because that monkey might want to kill me, to eat me, or to maybe mate with me. Whatever is the situation, I better pay attention. It has survival value. Now, something that many, many years ago was something that we use in the wild has now been transferred to the social environment, you. And something that was critical for survival is now critical for social adaptation, for us to deliver the social niceties that Rita was talking about this morning. But this is how fundamental we see this condition. There seems to be something going on in the ability to process that. And why am I saying that? Because here we go. So you saw how we produced that. We created an experimental paradigm. So now you see that animation upright over here, and here you see that animation upside down, inverted, on this side, okay? And it's not only being played in an inverted fashion, it's also being played backward. Okay? And the reason why we played it backward is because if we played it at the same time, we didn't want children to basically just go from one to the other because these are mirror images. Okay? So this is what we do. At the same time, they are hearing what the caregiver is saying. Okay? Hi, baby, patty cake, those kinds of things. And so this is what happens. They hear what the caregiver is doing. Hi, baby. And here they see the animation upright, and here they see the animation in inverted fashion. And it's been known that the moment that you invert this animation, for babies, the whole process is broken down. It seems that they are somehow very, very sensitive to gravity. But the fact is that adults, when they are approaching babies, they tend to approach babies upright rather than inverted. So it makes sense, correct? I'm always worried when I'm being translated because I tend to say very silly things. And if I don't get any reaction from the other, I'm not sure that I'm being understood. So I may move on to Spanish in a moment, okay? But anyway, so here we are. So this is the paradigm. We expect that if babies are capable of attributing meaning to that animation, is that they're going to look more here than here, okay? So this is the story. Now, you remember that little girl. We compared that little girl with two other babies. One was a 15-month-old, typically developing 15-month-old a girl, and here we involved a 9-month-old, typically developing baby. This girl had the same cognitive ability than her, and this girl here had the same language ability than her because she had language delays already by the time that she was 15 months of age. Now, if she is seeing those two animations randomly, meaning it doesn't mean anything, what you're going to have is that she will not show preference for any. Now, both the 15-month-old little girl and the 9-month little girl showed a preference for the upright. Animations. We used about 9 of those animations. And she was random to all of them with one exception. And that exception had to do with an animation that had patty cake, okay? And so we ask ourselves the question, why? Look, with patty cake, she was entirely on the upright. So she got the task, right? She was preferentially oriented to the upright. And so we ask the question, why is patty cake any different from all of the other animations that we used? Okay? Because her results were so different from everything else. And then we watched patty cake ourselves. And this is what happens. Patty cake, bakers, man, bake. You see what is happening there? Apart from making a fool of myself. You see what was happening there? This is what's happening there. In all of our other animations, the speech of the caregiver was contextual, meaning that it would not map on those lights, on those point lights going this way and that way, we thought. But in this animation, what happened is that every time that those point lights collided, there was a clap, okay? And so we had this crazy idea that maybe that girl who is so oblivious to the social nature of those point lights was acutely sensitive to point lights colliding and making a sound. Now, that's not a social contingency. It's a physical contingency, okay? And so that's what we wanted to do. Because as you see, here, if you could hear, the clapping is totally contingent with that. But because this was inverted and played backwards, it was not synchronous. The point lights would go like this, but there was no clapping. So this is what we thought. And then, of course, we could look into the eye tracking data for that little girl as she was watching that animation. Now, if that hypothesis was right, where would she be looking at? She would be looking at the clapping, okay? And that's exactly what happened, if you could see, is that she's looking exactly to where that clap was going on. Okay? Now, we thought, what are the implications of that? Here's a little girl who is not showing a skill that newborns have, something that is evolutionarily very basic indeed, something that predisposes us to orient to people. She is totally random in her viewing of those two sides of our animations, and yet she's acutely sensitive to a physical contingency, like two things hitting each other and making a sound. Okay? So we ran a study. The same three groups that you saw before, the children with autism, the typically developing group, and the non-autistic but developmentally delayed group. And this is what we found. We found that the group of 2-year-olds with autism were entirely random in the way that they watch those animations, meaning they don't seem to mean much to them. And here what you see is basically a strong preference by the typically developing group to the upright animation. And you also see a very, very strong preference for the upright animation in the non-autistic but developmentally delayed children. So they are processing that, our children are not. Now, the same thing happens with patty cake. Here we cure them. The children with autism were now showing a very strong preference for patty cake, meaning that once again, they were seeking that physical contingency, even though they appeared to be entirely blind to the social nature of those animations. But then we start asking ourselves other questions. And one of the questions that we start to ask is this: wait a minute. Remember that they were totally random in the way that they watched those animations. Could it be that what was guiding their visual behavior, knowing that it was not the social nature of what we presented to them, could it be that in all of those animations, they were actually seeking contingencies? Because even though we were not aware of that, if you could hear this animation, the guy was going, here's an airplane, ooh. So there is some spurious, but there is some contingency, some synchrony between the sounds that he's making and some of his movements. And so we ask ourselves the question, could it be that they are, in fact, looking for physical contingencies all the time as they're watching something that has this incredibly social nature? And so what we did, we basically measure change in motion of the upright stimulus. And here you have basically a running graph of how much change of motion there is. And then we also measured the change of motion in the inverted animation. Can you see that? I hope you can. Okay? We measured that. And then we measured the change in amplitude of sound. Basically, how much change in loudness there was in the speech that people were offering these kids. And then we measure synchrony. Basically, we multiply this by this, and those peaks here tell you when a lot of audiovisual synchrony was happening, just like the clapping and the sound. I hope that's clear to you. And here you have those peaks of audiovisual synchrony. And here what you see is that there was less audiovisual synchrony in the inverted, because you remember we're playing it backwards. And the speech only go forward, of course. And so this is what we predicted. Okay? And if you want to see audiovisual synchrony happening in the world, you have to promise to me that when you're watching that animation, you're not seeing a person. You have to look at those point lights as exactly that, point lights. I wish you could hear them too. But point lights and sounds, not social at all. If you do so, you're going to see that there is all sorts of audiovisual synchronies happening all the time. The more they are, the hotter the color, and the less there is, the colder the color, and so that you don't see them at all. So you see, there is synchrony happening here too, just stereosynchrony between sounds and point lights. And then what we did is, because we are interested in the comparison between upright and inverted, we measure how much more there was audiovisual synchrony on the upright relative to the inverted. And we did that for all of our animations. Okay? And this is what we found. Here is how much they are looking more at the upright. Okay? And this is all the 2-year-olds with autism. How much more they are looking at the upright. So a lot for patty cake. And on this axis, what you have is how much more audiovisual synchrony, a physical contingency, was happening on the upright relative to the inverted. Okay? And this is what we found. Here is much more upright than inverted, and here it's almost the same on the upright and the inverted. And those balls tell you how much they prefer to look at the upright. And when we did that, what we found out is that we could predict 90% of their visual behavior on that task on the basis of audio-visual synchrony. I'll tell you what does that mean in a moment. Now, this did not happen with either the typically developing 2-year-olds or the non-autistic 2-year-olds, but cognitively delayed 2-year-olds. Basically, they're watching the social thing. They couldn't give a damn for the physical contingencies. Now, when we submitted that to a journal, they told us, very nice, but you know what? You need to conduct 2 additional experiments because there is a whole range here that you did not cover with the animations that you created. We did that all sort of post factum. In a way, we are reanalyzing data that we had before because we didn't expect that finding. And so what we did is that we created 2 additional animations, this one and that one. In this one, we basically had the same animation, but we removed the sound. So now we didn't have that audiovisual synchrony. And here we are really naughty, and we actually synchronized the clapping sound with the clapping on the inverted animation. Okay? And in this way, we created those 2. And lo and behold, they fell exactly here, which is basically on that regression line, telling us that indeed we could predict the visual behavior of those babies on the basis of that hypothesis. What does that mean? Remember that little girl spent a lot of time looking at that mouth? Remember that? What happens in the mouth? This is the source in your body of the greatest audiovisual synchrony of all time, because every time that you speak, your lips move. And so in many ways what we're talking about is lips moving and speech happening synchronously with that. But then we have to ask ourselves the question. These are 2-year-olds who are watching somebody approaching them. They are watching faces like you and I. But are they processing those faces in the same way? if what they are seeking in those phases is physical contingencies. Okay? So that's slightly different. Much, much different. Because they seem not to be processing those people as people. And that's a problem. I'm not saying that they're going to do that forever. But I can promise you that if they don't have that natural orientation to people in this way, they are going to learn about people in a completely different way. They're going to be less directly engaged, and their intuitive sense of the other is going to be reduced. So what happens with looking at people is that something that babies do from the first days of life. So this is a lovely little baby. She's only about 3 months of age or 5 months of age, and she is a little girl, a typically developing little girl, and we've been conducting those studies. Basically, we want to know the extent to which she spends time looking at people's eyes or not, because we would love to quantify that so that we can identify vulnerabilities for autism, not when the child is 2 years old, but in the first months of life. Remember that that skill is online from the first days of life. And you know what? They love being there, so it's great. Now, this is now a typically developing 5-month-old little girl. And this is how she's watching that caregiver, spending a lot of time on their eyes. And this is a 5-month-old who subsequently was found to have autism. And you see that that 5-month-old, and this is not his name, this is a code, is watching those people very differently, spending a lot of time on that hand movement and on that mouth. Now, in about a couple months, we're going to basically synthesize the work that we've been doing for quite some time. We're following babies every month from the time that they are born until they are 6 months, and then every 3 months until they turn to be 24 months. And hopefully what we are going to be able to show is not unlike what you have in your pediatrician's office, that you have a height and a weight chart. We want to chart your social engagement. We want to delineate the ontogeny of social engagement so that we can then see deviations thereof from very early on. And we expect to see that before those children begin to exhibit symptoms of autism. Because this approach is not about detecting symptoms of autism, if by that I mean unusual behaviors. What we are looking into is the breakdown of a very, very basic mechanism of socialization, so that we can make sense of some of the data that we know from neurobiology, like, for example, accelerated head growth. We don't know what that means. We know that that's supposed to happen in the first 2 years of life of individuals with autism, but we don't know what are the clinical implications of that. And one thing that I would pose to you is that we spend a lot of time in genetics. We spend a lot of time in cognitive science just figuring out that, gee, there is so much heterogeneity in behavior, but believe me, there is even more heterogeneity in genetics. Nowadays, I can promise you, there are not going to be 5 or 6 or 7 genes for autism. There are going to be tens and tens of genes. We know that there are many autisms out there. So the question that we begin to ask is not how come those kids are so different, but how come they are alike? How come somebody who is a clinician and walks into the playroom can immediately recognize that they have autism or something similar to it? And the reason we pose is because of that mutually reinforcing choreography between infants and caregivers that we talked about. This happens within a period of time. And our guess is that if whatever is the cause of that disruption happens very early on in life, there is going to be a cascade of events very likely to leave the child more disabled. Then, for example, if it happened here, or if it happened here, or if it happened at a later stage in life. So what we pose is that, we spend a lot of time thinking that the genes or the genetic research is going to solve our problems. Boy, I don't feel so, even though I'm part of those consortia. Okay? What we need to go back is to an understanding of what does it take to be social. If we have that mapping quantification, then we can go back to the brain and see what is actually maturing at those times. And what are the candidate areas that we should be focusing more on. And why should we do that? We talk about early identification of children with autism. We didn't talk much today about early intervention. The notion is that if we're capable of identifying those children early on, we can build on the plasticity of the brain, on the plasticity of behavior. so that we can then make a dent into the natural course of the condition and optimize that outcome. This is basically just a cartoon of what happens in our brain. We are spaghetti-like as we are inside our mommy's tummy. But soon enough, we find out that there is structure. And that structure is only partially genetically determined, because a lot of what happens in terms of specialization of the brain is the result of experience. So what I have is a positive message, is a message of optimism, that we might be able not only to reduce behavior and to optimize outcome, but in doing so, we're also changing brain. Okay? So that was the idea of what we do. Those are the kinds of contraptions that we invented, and reminding you that this is how I started. I started with the notion that there are different, divergent pathways to socialization. It doesn't mean that this is any worse than this, but it means that this is different. And in order for us to be effective clinicians and interventionists, we need to focus on that. And tomorrow, hopefully, I'm going to get on that for the adults that we're going to be talking about and the concept of Asperger's syndrome. Okay? Thanks to you for inviting me. Thank you to our sponsor agents, the National Institute of Health, the National Science Foundation, and on. And most importantly, thanks to the children who come to see us, and to my very dear colleagues.
Thank you, Rami, for your brilliant communication. I call on Sarah Curran and discussers. It's time to discussion. We have time to 2 or 3 questions.